Hi, I like movies. You may notice I'm not showing my face today, and that's just because I moved back to Chicago to finish up school, and I'm still getting situated, and the room's a mess. Plus, this was a very last-minute video idea, and it's easier to edit if it's just my voice. So, yeah. Also, I'm going to talk about spoilers, so you've been warned. So, the Snyder Cut. It exists. It's here, and you can watch it right now, which is honestly pretty crazy. After all, it's not every day that a movie gets released after the company who made it flat out denied it even existed. Yet here we are years later, and a radically different version of the controversial film has been released to the masses after a massively successful social media movement. DC fans everywhere ask questions regarding whether or not Snyder's version of the film even existed, but strangely enough, it seems the last thing people were asking about was whether or not it was any good. If it was, why didn't they just stick with it and finish that version? If it stunk, how could it be any worse than the cut of the film we got? To be perfectly honest, I was very skeptical myself, but after sitting through the entire thing... Well, before I get into that, let me give you a brief history lesson into how we got to this point. Just a quick little recap into the Snyder saga so far. I guess I can start with how I feel about Snyder as a director. He's become a bit of a punching bag when it comes to film criticism, with many comparing his directorial style to someone like Michael Bay, with a massive over-reliance on action and explosions. To be completely honest, I've never disliked Snyder as a filmmaker, and I've really enjoyed a lot of his previous films. 300 is an absolute blast, and a visual treat that makes a man like myself constantly question his sexuality. The mark of any great film. I also overall enjoyed his version of Watchmen. It has a few things I don't like, and frankly the HBO sequel series blows it out of the water in comparison. But on the whole, it's a very solid adaptation of source material that is notoriously difficult to adapt. Hell, I even like that fucking owl movie he made. It's purty. So given that I liked a lot of his previous work, I, like everyone else, was uber mega hyped for Man of Steel. When that first trailer came out and you saw him fly into the sky with that Hans Zimmer score blaring in the background, everyone was hyped. Everyone was interested in seeing a modern new take on the most popular superhero of all time. The movie came out and it seemed half of the people who watched it loved it and the other half absolutely hated it.
Man of Steel sucks! Man of Steel is freaking awesome and you know it!
It's easily one of the most divisive and polarizing superhero flicks ever made. Some heralded it as a masterpiece that took the character of Superman into a bold new direction, while others scolded it as a cinematic dumpster fire that completely misunderstands the Superman mythos. Me personally, I'm a bit on the fence in regards to it. There's a few moments that I think are really fun, such as the Smallville fight, but its wanton destruction starts to feel a bit too much like destruction porn for my taste. Despite my grievances, I was still interested in how a sequel could address Man of Steel's shortcomings, and we all got excited all over again when we found out that Batman was going to be in it. And then Batman v Superman released not long after, and the only way they could have cocked it up more is if they were all dressed up as roosters. Yeah, I hate this movie. More than hate it, in fact. I would go as far to say it is one of my least favorite movies ever made, and I make that no secret. I've mercilessly mocked it in most of my older videos. Hell, I even made a short film expressing how dumb I thought it was when I was like 16. Yeah, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Almost nothing about this movie works for me. I don't think it's aesthetically pleasing at all. The story is borderline incomprehensible, and the character motivations are either poorly defined or just completely non-existent altogether. So many scenes that I just dislike on a fundamental level, like the Jolly Rancher scene, or the Martha twist, or that part where they're in a courtroom and there's a literal actual jar of Lex Luthor's pee just sitting there and the movie expects you to be afraid of it, but no one's actually acknowledges it. All right, sorry, I gotta calm down. I told myself before I started that I wouldn't go into another BVS tangent. I already do that all day, every day, on the daily. It's becoming a serious problem and I need psychological help. Anyways, despite the film having its fans, people seem to dislike BVS even more than MOS. It didn't even make $1 billion at the box office, which might not sound like a huge deal, but considering that this is the first ever live-action film to feature Batman and Superman together on screen, that's kinda shocking. But it still made enough to justify more films, and eventually we got the Joss Whedon version of Justice League. This time around, not only did the typical critics dislike it, but the people who stuck around to defend the previous two Snyder films also hated it. While I don't think it's quite as atrocious as Batman v Superman, it's still pretty bad. The massive tonal shift definitely feels like a response to the grim despair set up from its predecessor, but also just makes it feel a bit too pandering to the Marvel crowd. I think the problem isn't that the film is all that bad, but it's just not as good as it needed to be. I mean, it's the Justice League, for crying out loud. A collection of icons uniting for the first time on screen. If it's mediocre or, God forbid, bad, that sucks. Where Batman v Superman might have underperformed both critically and financially, the theatrical version of Justice League bombed. It wasn't even able to break even at the domestic box office, and of course there's that ongoing PR nightmare regarding Whedon's behavior on set, which I won't get too much into. Now, with that little history lesson out of the way, you're probably wondering why I skimmed over a pretty big detail. The question of why did Zack Snyder leave the project to begin with? You can thank the human cesspool that is tabloid entertainment media for claims that Warner Brothers fired Snyder due to the critical backlash of his previous entries, but that's simply not the case. While it may be partially or even wholly true that Warner Brothers was concerned about the course of the franchise and brought in Whedon to assist with rewrites following his work on the first two Avengers films, to say that was the only reason leaves out a fundamentally crucial detail. On March 22, 2017, Zack Snyder announced that he would be stepping down from the project as director following the tragic suicide of his daughter, Autumn. It's a horribly traumatic and horrific experience that no parent should ever have to go through. I do not blame Snyder for 1 second for the decision to step away and be with his family. He understandably decided that his loved ones and personal mental health was far more important than making a superhero movie. Again, I hated Batman v Superman, but that doesn't mean I hate Zack Snyder. I don't hate him as a filmmaker, and I definitely don't hate him as a person. We live in an age where nerds on the internet are constantly judging people based on their creative work rather than the integrity of their character. Imagining what he was going through really gave me a different perspective about the art of filmmaking that I had back in high school. Some films might not appeal to me, and that's okay. I should never tell a director, actor, cinematographer, what have you, to stop doing what they're doing, because frankly, who am I to tell someone to stop doing what they love to do? I'm just a guy on the internet who likes movies and likes talking about movies. It's not like he's a doctor who botched the surgery. He's just a guy who made a film. You should absolutely be able to criticize his work, but I don't think you need to make it personal. You see that all the time with Star Wars nowadays, and it's just ugly. It doesn't add anything to the conversation. Nothing about it's constructive, and you just have a bunch of angry, mean people being mean and angry. With all that in mind, even though I had little optimism for a future project in Snyder's universe, if the now widespread release the Snyder Cut hashtag was a success, I would have been happy that Snyder would be able to release the version of the film he wanted to. Which brings us to today, in a world where Zack Snyder's version of Justice League has been released, and now after a long-winded introduction, I'll tell you my thoughts on it now that you're all well aware of how much of a critic I am of Snyder's initial vision. So right off the bat, you'll notice a couple things on the technical side when it comes to this film. For starters, as you've probably noticed already, the aspect ratio looks kind of funky. That's because Snyder opted to shoot in 4:3 rather than the industry standard widescreen format. Despite initially seeming smaller, the actual width of the frame is the same as the widescreen format, but you see more of the length, hence why you see the black bars on the side of the screen rather than on the top and bottom of it. It's unconventional and definitely takes some getting used to, but at the end of the day, you're seeing more of the movie. I would definitely recommend watching this on the biggest screen possible, which I guess is true for all movies, but especially true for this one given its unique aspect ratio. Secondly, much like the slightly better but still not great extended cut of Batman v Superman, Snyder's Justice League is rated R. Again, pretty unusual, but thankfully it's not just some plastering of CGI blood. Characters drop F-bombs, people get cut in half, but it never feels too gratuitous or overblown, and could probably still be considered a PG-13 if they really wanted to. And lastly, the movie is 4 hours long.
4 hours! Bullshit! God!
That's a length that has not been seen in a high-profile feature film for a long time. This is probably the biggest thing that will turn people off from watching it. Yes, there are little markers to show distinct chapters at the bottom of the timeline when you watch it on HBO Max, but I don't think that's going to really change anyone's minds when it comes to the runtime of the film. But here's my perspective on length in film. In my opinion, there is no such thing as a too long or too short movie. Instead, I think there are films that use their time well and films that use their time poorly. Lawrence of Arabia is almost 4 hours long, and I am not bored for 1 second watching that movie. I am so invested in its story, world, and characters that it feels just as long as any other feature film, despite being nearly double the runtime. Taken 2 is only an hour and a half, and yet it feels like it goes on forever. That movie feels like it's 6 hours because it's so friggin' boring. When someone says that a movie is too long or too short, what they're really saying is that the movie failed to get their attention. So with that question asked, does the Snyder Cut use its time well? The short and concise answer is ultimately, yes. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'm actually pleasantly surprised with just how much fun I had watching it. And I mean genuine enjoyment, rather than an ironic, so bad it's good type of enjoyment. Although there were some things that I didn't enjoy as much, and I'll get those out of the way first before going any further. Since we're already on the topic of length, I will admit that 4 hours feels like a bit too much. There is a lot, and I do mean a lot, of slow motion here. And while it's very much a Snyder staple and is cool sometimes, it felt like it was present in every other scene. Plus, a lot of them have this overly dramatic indie song attached to them, and these were some of the few points where the film just grinded to a halt for me. It's not that these scenes are bad, or poorly done, or not relevant to the story. It's just that they could have been shortened a little bit. There's only a handful of parts in the film that I didn't like. I found the opening of Superman dying and screaming so loud that everyone hears them to be extremely corny and goofy. The part where Cyborg is learning how to use his powers is actually really cool, but also is kind of weird, like that part where he gives this woman money out of thin air. I mean, it's a nice thought, but that's not really how the economy works. It seems like a really good way to put us in another recession. And then there's also a scene that is done better in this than the Whedon cut, but still just doesn't really feel necessary, which is that scene where Superman comes back and he's evil and doesn't know who he is, and then they have to fight him, and it feels like a time waster, to be totally honest. But here's the crazy thing. Those are my only major complaints. Everything else in the film I thought was just fine or genuinely really good. One of my biggest complaints of Batman v Superman is just how unfocused the whole thing is. You would think that with that title, this would be a story about Batman and Superman, but instead it's about Lois Lane pointing out that Lex Luthor is evil. It's about Lex Luthor being cryptic and weird all the time. It's about a random guy who lost his legs. There's just way too much going on in that film, and none of it feels cohesive. And even though the Snyder Cut is nearly twice as long, it never majorly shifts focus to these random subplots and characters. Even the theatrical cut did that. For God's sakes, I don't give two shits about this random Russian family. Go back to the superheroes! So the story is there, and it's cohesive and easy to follow. That's obviously an extremely important early step to get right. But what about the characters? Do they factor well enough into this story? Do they address the character issues that were present in the previous film? Well, I'm happy to say that the characters this time around are far more defined and interesting. The most improved award goes to Batman, who thankfully is no longer some sort of homicidal maniac. Yeah, he kills parademons, but those are like zombie alien things, so I'll allow it. I think making him a bit more optimistic here works really well for this incarnation of the character. I think that is who Batman is, someone who's cold and brooding on the outside, but is really a sweetheart on the inside. Superman is also greatly improved, and he was one of the only things in the Whedon version that I kinda liked. Yes, the CGI mustache removal looked horrible, and looks way better in this one somehow, but I kinda liked that he was more quippier and lighthearted instead of the brooding douchebag that he was in the previous two.
But if I win, you're off the team.
I'm okay if Batman's like that, but when you make Superman and Batman like that, it kinda ruins the whole dynamic for me. Snyder's version doesn't lean too much into that quippiness, but you still get the sense that this is a much more hopeful and optimistic character.
Not impressed.
Wonder Woman's about the same, but she didn't need much work to begin with. But to me, the most important characters to get right were the three members of the team we haven't met yet. Aquaman we know well enough since he got a movie after Justice League came out, and he's pretty straightforward. He's the tough muscle who seems selfish but really has a heart of gold. And I think that's a pretty smart way to introduce Aquaman, seeing as how much of a joke the character usually is. Cyborg gets the most new development out of anyone. For some reason, I was always confused why they chose him over someone like Green Lantern or something. I don't care if he's in Justice League in the new 52 comic run or whatever. He is a Teen Titan first, and he always will be.
Booyah!
That being said, his role here makes perfect sense, what with his direct link to the mother boxes. And then there's Flash, who's still very much the comic relief character of the group and still the most inexperienced of the bunch. Not all of his jokes hit, but he's likable enough and becomes relevant enough to the story that you can root for him, especially towards the end. There's some very cool and clever ways the film plays with time when Flash uses his powers. With the defined characters, they also have a great team dynamic. They butt heads sometimes, but it never feels like childish bickering. They understand the gravity of the situation and form a real bond with each other. Some of the best moments in the movie are when the team members are just interacting with each other. Almost every character on the team has a one-on-one sequence with each other, and it was a really great way to know these characters and learn their dynamic with each other. Even stupid Steppenwolf is an improvement. I would maybe have liked it a bit more if they delved into his backstory a little bit, because they kind of tease it but don't really go all in with it. But his design looks way better, and he feels like a much more significant threat. Again, he was a character that I was skeptical on because, frankly, who fucking cares about Steppenwolf? But the fact that Steppenwolf is so powerful, yet he's just a minion to Darkseid, really makes Darkseid seem like a very big threat. Darkseid is here as well, though he doesn't have much to do. He is very much the DC equivalent of Thanos, both in the comics and here. But that's fine, because this is really just his introduction, and I imagine Snyder expected us to see a lot more of him in the future. All in all, the characters are far more investable and believable. I understood what they were doing and why they were doing it, which is way more than I could say about that other film that I feel I've mentioned more times than this one.
It's cherry.
All of these story details come back to the writing. Anyone who knows anything about filmmaking knows that the screenplay is your blueprint for your film. And I think there is one crucial reason why this screenplay succeeds while its priors have failed. It all comes down to one key word: levity. The first two Snyder films took themselves so fucking seriously. It's a dark tone, but that's a type of tone that only works if you have an engaging storyline. If you don't, not only are you bored, but you're also miserable. I am a staunch believer that every film, regardless of how serious the subject matter is, should always have levity. Though admittedly that is to varying extents. Most people associate levity with humor, but that's not the only way it can manifest itself. All it can be is a moment where our characters can just relax and have a low-key conversation, like those one-on-one conversations that I mentioned earlier. It's a way to give both the characters and the audience a break during the film's main conflict. Nolan's The Dark Knight trilogy is obviously a dark and realistic take on Batman, yet it still has some lax and humorous moments.
You think you could steal from us and just walk away?
Yeah.
I'm putting the word out.
Hell, Schindler's List. Fucking Schindler's List! An uninhibited portrayal of the Holocaust has some genuinely sweet and funny moments in it. However, it's also very easy for levity in film to become too overpowering, as we saw in the theatrical cut. It's also something that many of the Marvel films are criticized for, and I think that's especially present in Captain America: Civil War. The stakes in that movie feel non-existent because every character is constantly cracking jokes and refusing to take their present situation seriously. It's a difficult balance to strike, for sure, but it's a balance that I think is essential for film. While the Whedon cut is definitely not good, I was concerned that Snyder would abandon the levity in favor for the grim darkness that was already set up previously. But thankfully, he didn't.
I'm so sorry.
Where Whedon's version feels like it was trying to copy Marvel's sense of humor, Snyder feels like he took inspiration from Marvel. And I don't think that's a bad thing. The film's tone was the biggest sign to me that Zack Snyder truly, seriously, and genuinely listened to criticism, while also following through on what he initially planned out. The characters aren't moping around and being angsty every second, but when they are, it feels like they have a good reason for doing so. They talk to each other like friends, make a joke every now and then. Hell, they even crack a smile sometimes, if you can believe it. And yet, this newfound levity and more hopeful tone doesn't feel completely out of nowhere, as the stakes still feel high. Initially, the villain, Darkseid, wins and kills everyone. and you feel the gravity of that even though the tone is lighter and more hopeful. So the story is solid, the characters are likable, even the action is a massive improvement with the epic scale and frame always being in focus. I think the CG quality could have been better and the slow-mo could have been toned down a bit, but it's always fun to watch whenever action is happening.
That was awesome.
And the last thing, the music. I really liked it. While I do miss the classic Batman and Superman themes, the soundtrack is very good, and I really enjoy how each hero has their own unique music with different instruments. So, the Snyder Cut is good, so that should cover everything, right? Oh wait, shit, Jared Leto's in this. So yeah, you probably heard that the Suicide Squad's Joker would be returning, and while that's true, it's not until the very, very end. And honestly, it's a good scene. It's probably helped by the fact that Joker doesn't look like a spokesperson for Hot Topic anymore and actually looks and acts like the fucking Joker, but he has a really cool exchange with his bat-cowled arch frenemy. It really feels like an end credit scene, and I feel like I should harp on it for being pointless to the rest of the plot, but this and the also super awesome Martian Manhunter cameo feel like little teases for what's to come, and I wouldn't criticize the Marvel end credit scenes for doing the exact same thing, so fuck it. Which brings me to the question everyone is asking now. What happens next? From early reports, it sounds like Warner Bros. Has no plans to continue any more films in the DCEU, at least in terms of Snyder's vision, and Snyder himself has said that that is the case. And yet, as far as I can tell, the Joker scene was one of the few scenes that was shot after the Snyder Cut release was announced. Why on earth would they spend all the money, time, and resources on a scene that is teasing a movie that they have no plans of making? I'll tell you why. It's a test. Whether it was Warner Brothers, Snyder, whoever is in charge, after the DCEU was dubbed practically dead on the arrival of Whedon's version of the film, they wanted to see if those who promoted release the Snyder Cut really wanted to see it, or if they were just following a social media trend. I think this is more than just an alternate version of a movie. I think it's a last-ditch effort to save this cinematic universe. So if Snyder's Cut does well enough and gets popular enough and is seen by enough people, you can bet your ass that they'll make this the canon version and then make a sequel. And you know what? And again, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I don't think I would mind watching it. When Batman v Superman came out, I firmly believed that this series was dead and over. They should just reboot and start over, and that seemed to be the direction they were going towards. But now, after watching a shockingly good Justice League film, I want to see more. In a way, Zack Snyder has accomplished something that very few filmmakers have. He proved so many critics and skeptics wrong by making something that many said was impossible. As someone who critiqued his previous work so much and so hard in the past, as someone who is an aspiring filmmaker who wants to make movies someday, it's really admirable what he was able to do. It's an underdog story, but it's fascinating. It's inspiring even. He really does deserve a lot of credit, and when I saw that tribute to Autumn at the end of the film, the only thing I could think of was how proud she would have been. Not only for following through on the film in the midst of a severe, heartbreaking tragedy, but also for all the good it's ultimately done, like raising $15,000 for mental health charities. So let's move on from hashtag release the Snyder Cut and go to hashtag release the Snyder Cut sequel. Fuck the Whedon version, nobody likes it. If you want more, support it. It's only been out for 3 days and I've seen it 3 times. I've invested 12 hours into a movie that's only been out for 1 weekend. Maybe I'm overthinking it, and maybe this is truly the last we'll see of this continuity. A brief window into a world that might have been. But if this whole saga and journey has taught me anything, it's to have hope, even when things seem cloudy and drab, or they stumble with a lackluster effort. The chance of a light at the end of the tunnel is always there, no matter how small it may be. And one more thing. I've also put a link in the description for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention if you'd like to support them. It's a great cause that helps those struggling with suicide-related illnesses all over the country and have many resources if you or anyone you know is facing those issues.